In this lecture, we review Augustine's challenge to the teachings of Pelagius and his followers, and the continuing debate over God's grace in the history of the Church. Now, little is known about the man Pelagius. He hailed probably from Britain or maybe Brittany in France, and he showed up in Rome sometime in the 380s. He was described as a big man, quote, weighed down by Irish porridge, one person said. And he first made a name for himself, ironically, defending Nicene orthodoxy against heretics like the Arians and the Apollinarians. But he became controversial after a tussle that he initiated with Jerome, a major figure in the late 4th century church. You see, a monk by the name of Jovinian had made the audacious claim that married Christians are on the same spiritual level as celibate monks. Now, this is virtual heresy at the time, because choosing a life of celibacy was considered a kind of bloodless martyrdom, as it was called. Remember, this was the era of spiritual superheroes. So if you can't die for Jesus, at least you can die to your desires. Jovinian's claim enrages Jerome, who attacked him in a treatise that even his friend said was over the top. A little bit too far there, Jerome. Pelagius, who may have been something of a self-promoter, he jumps into the fray and he charges Jerome with denigrating marriage, just like the heretical Gnostics did. And Pelagius actually kind of had a good point. Next, Pelagius took aim at another great leader of the late 4th century, Augustine. You see, Augustine had written in his Confessions this line, "Give me strength, O Lord, so that I may do all things. Give me the grace to do as you command, and command me to do what you will." Now, Pelagius took great offense at this and said God has already given us everything we need to do his will. You see, Pelagius is an advocate of rigorous theology, something that we've already seen in the early church, an emphasis on good behavior rather than God's grace. Pelagius just pushes it further. In fact, Pelagius understands the grace of God to be, first of all, the fact that God created humanity with a free will to choose the good. And secondly, grace is the fact that God gives humanity the law and conscience to remind us of the good. Now, Pelagius's doctrine of humanity, his theological anthropology, is key to understanding his thought. He emphasizes that humanity was created with reason, rationality, and freedom of the will. And God does not demand the impossible. That would be unjust. Now, nobody disagrees with that. But what about the effects of the fall into sin? That's where it gets problematic. Pelagius says that the freedom of the will and the integrity of reason are not compromised by the fall. So what Pelagius says is that humanity is merely confused and reluctant to obey because, well, we've just gotten into bad habits. What he says is that sin does not affect human nature. It only seems like our nature has been affected because of our bad habits. There is no state of sin. There are only individual sins, and death is not a result of sin. It's just part of our created nature. So according to Pelagius, you just have to pull up your socks and start being good. Just do it. Now, related to Pelagius's view of redemption is his division of history into 3 periods. The first is the age of nature and extends from Adam to Moses. Pelagius emphasizes that God created humanity with the capacity to know God and what's right and what's good, and he has very high confidence in the power of the human conscience. Many would say too much confidence. And the fall into sin for him does little more than set a bad example that people follow because, well, they're morally lazy. And if you notice on page 48 of your reading from Pelagius, his comments on Job, who he claims is proof that one can be perfect without the law or the gospel. Next, the age of the law extends from Moses to Christ. God gave the law to the people to remind them after they'd gotten confused because of their bad habits. And the law is a reminder of what they should have known and could really know if they tried hard enough. Then there is the age of grace, and that begins with the coming of Christ. Now, it's often said that Pelagius merely sees Christ as an example, and that's not completely accurate. Christ is an example, a moral example, but he's also, in some sense, the Redeemer. In Pelagius's commentary on the Pauline epistles, which, by the way, survives only because his followers falsely attributed it to Jerome, Pelagius says that we are justified by faith alone. At first, Christ redeems us from pre-baptismal sin. That's the common view at the time, remember. But afterwards, according to Pelagius, Christ plays the same role as the law or the human conscience, reminding us of what is right. So in baptism, Christ forgives us of previous sins. Now it's up to you to be morally perfect. Martin Luther frequently said that the mark of a real theologian is to properly distinguish between law and gospel. And Pelagius fails this test big time. For Pelagius, grace is really information, not transformation. Grace is a friendly reminder to smarten up and get your act together. And Pelagius has a very naive perspective, I think, on the power of sin and the sinful will. Centuries later, William of Ockham, very important late medieval theologian, known for his razors, by the way, Occam's razors, would later say that sometimes the will just does things that are utterly inexplicable. Or as Woody Allen said after marrying his adopted daughter and blowing off the whole universe's disapproval, the heart has its reasons. Pelagius likes what Paul says in Philippians 2:12 about working out your salvation in fear and trembling, but he ignores what Paul says in the next verse, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in according to fulfill his good purpose. You know, what's really lacking in Pelagius's theology is the Holy Spirit and the work of the Holy Spirit in a person's life. By the way, that verse from Philippians 2:13, that's behind what Augustine had said in his Confessions. Give me your grace and command what you will. So Augustine encounters Pelagius and his criticism of Augustine, and he responds, he teaches that God created human beings with a nature that was free but mutable, that is, changeable, susceptible to change. Adam and Eve were created possa non peccare, that is, they had the capacity not to sin. They were able not to sin. So for Augustine, the cause of the fall is disordered love. Human beings chose to love themselves more than loving God. So amor sui, love of self, takes precedence over the amor Dei, love of God. And where Augustine and Pelagius really differ is in the effects of the fall. Where Pelagius saw the human will as basically intact, Augustine sees the human will as fundamentally distorted. And now human beings are non possa non peccare, that is, they are not able not to sin. Think about this. This is actually something you can test out. Tomorrow, I'd like all of you not to sin. You get up in the morning, just try not to sin at all, and then report to me and tell me how that worked out. Now, somebody might object, this is just fatalism, it's determinism. But Augustine says we freely choose our bondage to sin because we make choices Sub specie boni, that is, under the appearance of the good. That is, we choose what seems to be good to us, what we believe will bring us delight. But now we think things rather than God will bring us delight. We think self-love rather than love of God and love of our neighbor will bring us delight. And so we make gods of sex or success or liquor or Facebook. Even good things can become idols if we make them our source of delight, according to Augustine. So how does Adam and Eve's sin affect later generations? Well, Augustine argues that sin is passed down through procreation, making babies, because human sexuality is now marred by disordered love. And his term for that is concupiscence, which means an excessive desire or lust, particularly sexual lust. And if you remember Augustine's story, for him, sexual sin was such a huge personal issue. And he taught that before human sin, human beings would make babies in a purely rational way, without any passion at all. It would be a very calm affair. I think maybe he was thinking about the British. I'm not sure. Sorry, that's a joke. But seriously, that's what he said. But like many others in his day, Augustine has a fairly negative view of human sexuality. One that I think has a pretty considerable unhealthy effect on future Christian theology and practice. Things like the church's demand that clergy be celibate and forego marriage. And I think it also, no doubt, contributes to a negative view of women, because often the blame is placed on women for men's desires, which is very sexist and patriarchal. In addition to this very unrealistic view of pre-fall procreation, Augustine says that all sex, including sex in marriage, is so tainted by sin that every child is now conceived in sin because they are conceived through intercourse. And I think that teaching, again, leads inevitably to a negative view of human sexuality. However, Cyprian and Tertullian, they had similar views on how sin is transmitted through procreation. So Augustine's not so different from those who went before him. Of course, Augustine took on the Pelagians in numerous treatises, but they gained followers, and Celestius, a certain disciple of Pelagius, probably pushed Pelagius's ideas even further. And so a gathering was called. It was the Conference of Carthage in 411. And it was convened especially to deal with the teachings of Celestius. And even though Augustine was not present, the African bishops condemned the following teachings of Pelagius and Celestius. First, that Adam was created mortal, and thus death did not result from the fall. That's condemned. That Adam's sin harmed only Adam and was not passed down to future generations. That is condemned. That infants are born sinless. That's condemned. It's contrary to Psalm 51, verse 5. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. That the human race did not die in Adam is condemned. The claim that the Old Testament law can save you just as well as the New Testament gospel is condemned. And the idea that some people lived sinless lives before Christ just by following their conscience, that teaching is condemned. Then an even more official Council of Carthage is called in 418. And this time Augustine is present, and it publishes 8 canons. First, Adam was not subject to death before the fall. Second, infants are baptized by the church for the forgiveness of sins because they are born in sin. Third, grace is required not only for past sins before your baptism, but also it is needed to resist sin after baptism. The Holy Spirit has to be active in your life. Fourth, God not only gives believers knowledge of our duty, as the Pelagians claimed, but also the desire to fulfill that duty also comes from God's grace. Fifth, without grace, we could do no good thing, that is, no saving good. Sixth, anyone who claims to be sinless is deceiving themselves. That comes right from the first letter of John. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. Seventh, believers pray for the forgiveness of their own debts in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts. Pelagius claimed that they were only praying for other people, maybe unbelievers. And again, related to the Lord's Prayer, believers pray for this forgiveness of debts sincerely and not just to be humble. That apparently was another Pelagian interpretation of the Lord's Prayer. Now, these councils did not put an end to all of the issues that people had with Augustine's theology, and there are certain people who question him. First of all, the monks of Hadrumetum in North Africa. Hadrumetum, well, we met online. No, Hadrumetum is an area near Tunisia, and they raise concerns about Augustine's view of grace and his view of predestination. And they fret about God's sovereignty over salvation. Does that mean that free will and human responsibility are out the window? Is Augustine's view of predestination deterministic? Does it just make us puppets? Why pray? Why preach if God is in total control of everything? Remember also that the monks are very focused on being moral, very focused on purity and doing good works. And so they view the faith as something you do. It's about being a good person. So that's the perspective they're coming from. And to clarify his views, Augustine writes a number of treatises. That's what he does best, write treatises, such as On Grace and Free Will and On Rebuke and Grace. And one of the things that Augustine clarifies is that since we don't know who is elect, we have to preach to everyone, because our prayers and our preaching can be the means that God uses to bring somebody to faith. And Augustine also has this doctrine of cooperating grace. God's grace comes to us and enables us to actually choose by our own choice the good, so that it truly is our choice. And then there are the monks of Gaul. Gaul is modern-day France. And because they're monks, of course, they get worried about emphasizing grace too much, because they're all about holiness. They're all about good works. And one of the most important of these monks is Vincent of Lerins. And he's famous for the Vincentian canon, which is not a large weapon. No, it is a rule, a guideline. And it's his statement that the criterion for judging what is truly authentic, what is truly Catholic in doctrine in the church is, quote, what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all, ubique semper et ab omnibus. But with this statement, he was subtly criticizing Augustine's views on grace and predestination, because Vincent was a monk. And as a monk, he emphasized good works alongside of divine grace. And so this statement is a statement of saying, well, I'm not so sure Augustine's doctrine really reflects Catholic teaching. I think it's a novel doctrine. You remember what we said about novelty. Not a good thing. In addition, it also contributes to the myth of patristic consensus. It really becomes the motto of that myth. The idea that all of the church fathers were agreed, and the reformers will later claim to represent this consensus of the church fathers. I hope you can tell by now that there really was no uniform consensus on a lot of things in the early church. There was consensus on the broad outlines of the faith, but on a lot of details there was not consensus. On the other hand, I don't want to totally reject the Vincentian canon, because I think it is a very attractive idea, but more as an aspiration. It's a goal. Catholicity of doctrine and teaching is a goal, an ideal that we aspire to. rather than an historical accomplishment that was accomplished in some year in church history, because it never was. Another important monk of Gaul is John Cassian. John was a Western advocate of Eastern monasticism, and the Eastern Church always had a stronger emphasis on human free will and less of an emphasis on divine grace and predestination. Now, John Cassian is often referred to as a semi-Pelagian. That's not really accurate in this time period. You could just as easily call him a semi-Augustinian. The term semi-Pelagian isn't really helpful in this period. But in any case, Cassian thought that some of Augustine's statements endangered human responsibility. Cassian emphasized that even sinful people sometimes do the right thing, and even unbelievers can do good in a certain sense. Now, Augustine would not disagree with that. And nearly a century after Augustine's death, the controversy over grace is still raging. Augustine's views are mostly vindicated at a council, the Council of Orange, sometimes called the Synod of Orange, technically the Second Council of Orange, that happens in 529. Orange is a city in modern-day Provence, France, near Avignon. The council condemns Pelagian tendencies, but it goes further than the earlier councils. It affirms that even the desire for salvation comes from God's grace. And it condemns the doctrine that God rewards those who try hard, or as it's popularly stated, do your best and God will do the rest. That, my friends, is heresy. But the canons are also open to broad interpretation. So, for example, the council condemns the idea that persons are predestined to evil. Now, many interpret that to mean that it condemns the doctrine of reprobation, the idea that God decrees some individuals would be left in their sins, except that reprobation is taught by many Catholic theologians, including Thomas Aquinas. So it probably doesn't mean that. In fact, both Arminians and so-called Calvinists both claim to affirm the teachings of the Council of Orange, even though they have very different views of predestination and grace. Many interpret the canons as teaching single predestination and condemning so-called double predestination, praedestinatio gemina. But many who say this don't really understand what theologians actually teach regarding predestination. This is the most misunderstood and misinterpreted doctrine in the Christian faith. We will look at it in more detail later in the course. Finally, the canons of the Council of Orange seem to have been largely forgotten or filed in the wrong cabinet or something until around the year 1530, because they seem to be unknown to the medieval church. And thus, some late medieval theologians like Gabriel Biel don't seem to realize that they are, in fact, teaching Pelagian doctrines. And it's the theology of Gabriel Biel that Luther rejects so emphatically. So the issues that are raised in the 4th and 5th century are still continuing in the 16th century and still continuing today.